Parents tried to reschedule my wedding for my brother's trip, but I refused. Now everyone is mad at me. I'm 28F, work a normal 9-to-5 job, and live pretty independently. I've been with my fiancé, Aaron, for over 4 years, and we've been engaged for about a year now. We're finally planning our wedding, something I've been dreaming of. I've put so much thought into every little detail, and for the last 4 months, I've been working my butt off to make sure everything is perfect. We've sent out the invitations, set the date, and all our loved ones are supposed to be there. Well, that was the plan, anyway. My parents, Brandon and Daisy, are an interesting duo. My dad is 58 and works at a construction company. He's always been more of the quiet, go-with-the-flow type. My mom, Daisy, is 55 and has been a stay-at-home mom for as long as I can remember. They've always had a soft spot for my older brother, Fred, who's 32. Actually, soft spot might be an understatement. He's definitely their favorite. The golden child, if you will. Fred is a bit of a character. He's always been ambitious, I'll give him that, but none of his business ventures ever really pan out. He's had multiple failed startups and seems to live in this fantasy world where the next big idea will finally make him rich. He's married to Alice, who's 30, and they have 2 kids, Ethan, who's 5, and Jenna, who's 3. Now, I don't have anything against them personally, but it's no secret that they live way beyond their means. My parents are constantly bailing them out, and it's gotten to the point where it's just expected. Fred and his family basically live off my parents' support, while I've always been the one who's had to fend for herself. When Aaron proposed to me, I couldn't wait to tell my family, even though I knew there'd be some drama, especially where Fred was concerned. But I tried to stay positive. I remember the day we announced our engagement. We had a small get-together at our place, just close family and friends. I was so excited to share the news, and for a brief moment, it felt like maybe my parents would be happy for me and not just focus on Fred. But of course, Fred and Alice managed to steal the spotlight. Right in the middle of our announcement, Fred starts talking about how he's considering launching a new business and that they're thinking of moving to a bigger house. The whole conversation shifted from our engagement to Fred's latest plans. It was frustrating, to say the least, but I didn't want to make a scene. I just swallowed my pride and let it slide. Aaron noticed, though, and later that night, he told me he was proud of how I handled it. That meant a lot to me. Setting the date was another ordeal. We picked a date 4 months out, giving everyone plenty of time to plan. I even checked in with my parents before finalizing it to make sure they didn't have any conflicts. They assured me they'd be there, no problem. I thought that was the end of it, but I should have known better. I went all out on the details. We chose a beautiful venue, picked out flowers, and found the perfect dress. Everything was falling into place, and I was getting more and more excited. This was supposed to be our day, a celebration of our love surrounded by the people who matter most to us. I even included Fred and Alice in the wedding party, hoping it would help smooth over any potential issues. But deep down, I knew there was a storm brewing. And that storm hit when my parents called me out of the blue with an urgent request. They needed to talk about the wedding, and it didn't sound good. A few weeks ago, my parents suddenly made plans with Fred and his family to go on a vacation. I was confused at first because I thought they were talking about a trip after the wedding. But no, they meant the same week as my wedding. They wanted to know if I could possibly move the date of my wedding because it conflicted with their vacation plans. I was stunned. I mean, I'd planned this wedding for months, set out invitations, booked everything, the venue, the caterers. And now they were asking me to change the date as if it was just some casual dinner party? My wedding day, the day that was supposed to be about Aaron and me, was suddenly less important than a last-minute vacation with Fred and his family. I tried to stay calm, but I was furious. I asked them why they would plan a vacation so close to the wedding date we'd already set. My mom's response? Well, you know how busy Fred's schedule is, and this was the only time they could all go together. I couldn't believe it. They were prioritizing Fred's vacation over my wedding. I told them that changing the date wasn't an option. Everything was already set, and there was no way I was going to move it just to accommodate Fred's vacation. My dad tried to play peacemaker, suggesting that maybe I could at least talk to the venue and see if they could switch dates, but I shut that down immediately. The date was set, and that was final. When I refused to change the date, my mom got upset and said I was being unreasonable. She went on about how family should come first and how I was making it difficult for everyone by being so rigid. She even accused me of trying to sabotage their relationship with Fred and his family. That really hurt, but I stood my ground. I told them I wasn't going to change the date, and if they couldn't make it, that was on them. They were silent for a moment, and then my mom said they'd have to think about it. They hung up without even saying goodbye. I couldn't believe my own parents were actually considering not coming to my wedding because of a vacation. Aaron was furious on my behalf and urged me to call them back and try to work things out. So, I did. I called them, hoping we could find some middle ground, but it didn't go as planned. I tried to explain how much this wedding meant to me, how long I'd been planning it, and how hurtful it was that they were even suggesting I move the date. But they were stubborn. My mom kept insisting that I was being unreasonable, and my dad kept saying that Fred's family had already booked everything, completely ignoring the fact I had booked everything in advance too, and it would be hard for them to change their plans. It was like talking to a brick wall. At that point, I knew I needed to involve the extended family. I reached out to my aunt, who I'm pretty close to, and explained the situation. She was just as shocked as I was and promised to talk to my parents. I hoped that maybe, hearing it from someone else would make them see how ridiculous they were being. But instead of backing down, my parents doubled down. They started calling other family members, trying to paint me as the unreasonable one. They said I was refusing to compromise and making things difficult for everyone. They even hinted that I was jealous of Fred and trying to punish him by not moving the wedding date. It was complete nonsense, but some of the family started to take their side, saying that I should be more flexible and considerate of Fred's family. It became clear that they were trying to manipulate me into giving in. They were using guilt and family pressure to try and force me to change the date. But I wasn't going to let them win. I had every right to have my wedding on the date I'd chosen, and I wasn't about to let them ruin it just to cater to Fred. So, I told them that the date was set, and if they couldn't make it, then that was their decision. But I wasn't going to change it. And that was final. So, Reddit, am I the asshole for not changing the date of my wedding because of their golden child's vacation? After posting my story here, I received an overwhelming amount of support and advice, and I'm really grateful to everyone who took the time to respond. Reading through the comments, a lot of people suggested that there might be more to my parents' sudden vacation plans than they were letting on. It got me thinking, so I decided to do some digging. I started by talking to my aunt again, who's always been more like a second mom to me. She knows how my parents are with Fred, so she wasn't surprised by what was happening. But when I mentioned the vacation, she got really quiet. After a moment, she admitted that she'd heard Fred was having some serious financial problems again. Apparently, his latest business venture had flopped, and he was in debt. My parents had been helping him out, again, but it wasn't enough. Fred was desperate and looking for a way to keep his head above water. It turns out, the vacation was actually a cover story. My parents were planning to take Fred and his family to Europe, but not for a leisurely getaway. They were going to meet with some potential investors Fred had found overseas. The whole trip was a last-ditch effort to get someone to invest in Fred's business before he lost everything. They were banking on this trip to save Fred's financial situation, and that's why they were so insistent on going. I was furious when I found out. It wasn't just about the vacation, it was about my parents once again prioritizing Fred over everything else, including my wedding. They were willing to miss my big day to try and bail Fred out of another mess he'd gotten himself into. After learning the truth, I knew I had to confront Fred. I called him up and asked if we could meet. I didn't tell him what it was about because I didn't want to give him time to prepare some excuse. When we met up, I went straight to the point. I told him I knew about the trip, the investors, and his financial troubles. At first, he tried to play it off, saying it was just a business opportunity that happened to coincide with a wedding date. But I wasn't buying it. He got defensive and said I didn't understand how much pressure he was under, how he was doing everything he could to provide for his family. I reminded him that this wasn't the first time he'd gotten himself into a financial hole and that our parents had been bailing him out for years. Fred finally admitted that things were bad. His business was on the brink of bankruptcy, and if this investor deal didn't work out, he'd lose everything. But instead of taking responsibility, he tried to guilt-trip me. He said that as his sister, I should want to help him in any way I could, even if that meant moving my wedding date. He accused me of being selfish and not caring about his family. That was the last straw. I told him that I'd supported him as much as I could over the years, but I wasn't going to sacrifice my wedding day for his poor decisions. I made it clear that I wasn't going to change the date, and if he couldn't be there, that was his choice. I left him sitting there. After the confrontation with Fred, I decided to reach out to Alice. I wasn't sure how much she knew about everything, and I wanted to hear her side of the story. We met for coffee, and I could tell she was nervous as soon as we sat down. She probably knew I wasn't there to chat about wedding plans. I asked her straight up how much she knew about Fred's situation on the Europe trip. She admitted that she was aware of the financial issues but didn't know all the details. Fred had kept a lot of it from her to protect her, but she knew things were bad. When I told her about the real reason behind the trip, she looked shocked. She had no idea that my parents were planning to use the trip to try and secure investors for Fred's business. Alice confessed that she'd been worried about Fred's spending habits for a while, but every time she brought it up. She also admitted that she wasn't thrilled about missing the wedding, but Fred had convinced her that this trip was crucial for their future. She looked genuinely upset when I explained how much this was hurting me and how it was causing a huge rift in the family. I could see that Alice was causing a tough spot. She wanted to support her husband, but she also didn't want to be the reason my parents missed my wedding. She promised to talk to Fred and see if they could figure out another way to handle the situation, but I wasn't holding my breath. Fred is nothing if not stubborn. I left the meeting feeling a little better knowing that Alice wasn't completely on board with his plan. But I also knew that, in the end, Fred was likely to do whatever he thought was best for him, regardless of how it affected the rest of us. With everything that had happened, I realized that the only way to resolve this was to get the whole family together and lay everything out on the table. I wasn't sure how it would go, but I knew that if we didn't address this head on, it would only get worse. So, I called a family meeting. I told my parents, Fred, and Alice that we needed to talk. No excuses, no postponing. We decided to meet at my parents' house. Aaron came with me for support, and I was glad to have him by my side. My parents were already there, and you could tell they were nervous. Fred and Alice arrived shortly after, with Fred looking defensive from the start. We all sat down in the living room, and I wasted no time. I started by telling them that I knew about Fred's financial troubles and the real reason behind the Europe trip. My parents looked shocked. Fred, on the other hand, tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but I wasn't having it. I didn't hold back. I laid everything out, the years of favoritism, the endless bailouts, and how this was just the latest example of them prioritizing Fred over me. I told them that I understood they wanted to help Fred, but there had to be a line, and this was it. I explained how much this wedding meant to me, how much work I'd put into planning it, and how devastated I was that they were willing to throw it all away for a trip. Then, I pulled out the evidence I'd gathered. I had copies of emails and messages between Fred and my parents discussing the trip, the investors, and how they needed to keep it quiet. I just remembered a few passwords, that's all. I even had a copy of the itinerary showing that the trip was scheduled during my wedding week. My parents looked like they wanted to crawl under the couch, and Fred was furious that I'd gone behind his back to get this information. I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them continue to manipulate me or make me feel guilty for wanting to have my wedding as planned. I also revealed that Alice wasn't fully on board with the trip, which seemed to catch Fred off guard.